So it's 10 o'clock, so let us start our Psalm studies. Enough with the schmoozing. So happy to see everybody. And I think we're going to start again with Julia today, right? Julia, are you with us?
I'm here.
Good morning, Julia. So nice to see you. Tell us what you'll be leading us with in song today.
Good morning to you and everyone. Good morning. So I'm going to bring out a song that was inspired from everyone's interpretations, a lot of people's interpretations of the first couple of Psalms involved the image of a tree, the strong rooted tree that flourishes. And this reminded me of a song that Cantor Ayelet Porzakonski shared for Tu B'Shvat last year at West End Synagogue. This is something she wrote, and she's now at Brooklyn Heights Synagogue, I believe. And I just wanted to quickly say that in a conversation a couple of days ago, everyone on the call remarked that as our lives have become more local, that the small kinds of micro changes in the greenery that surrounds us, whether plants in our home or if we can get out, the potted plant that now has a bulb that's beginning to emerge, and we see that today there's a flower where yesterday there wasn't. Or for me, there's a tree that I try to visit every day that has these long, graceful limbs and these tendrils of white flowers. And Kristen and I have taken to calling it the wedding tree because it's a beautiful tree that one might want to get married under. So just that nature is nourishing us during this time as our lives have gotten smaller and more localized. And so today I'm going to share just the melody for this song, and tomorrow I'll bring in the words. And I invite you, as I share the melody, to just conjure up an image of some green that you have been enjoying in the past week or two. Okay. Lie, 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 lie. Lie, 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 lie. Lie, 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 lie. Lie, 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 lie. Lie, 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 lie. Lie, 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 lie. Lie, 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 lie. Lie, 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 lie. Lie, 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 lie. Thanks, everyone.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Julia. And I just want to remind people, just in terms of Zoom etiquette, try and make sure that we have your name, not just a phone number on your on your box or tile, people are calling them. And I see there are a couple of people whose phone numbers only appear. If you would just write your name in the chat so we know who you are. We are going to have to start getting stricter, and we're going to really not be allowing people in whose names we don't see. And if you don't identify yourself in the chat, unfortunately, we might have to eject you in order to keep the Zoom classroom safe. So I know that for some people it's better to put them on, but please identify yourself for the really appreciated. So good morning. Done with, which includes Yunt of Pesach, and so disruption in our daily study time together. And I think now would be set for 4-day week. Shavuot. We have another holiday now in Shavuot, which will interrupt our studying. So I'm very excited about that. And we will today jump into Psalm 3. So in our weeks together, we've done Psalm 1 and 2. And you'll find yourself going back to them. Has everybody noticed in Rabbi Ayelet's Cohen prayer for our country, there's a reference to Psalm 1 in that prayer? Have people noticed that more now that after having studied it? I don't remember the line she uses, but something like being rooted like a tree standing by the water. If people notice that, and when we say this prayer for our country, that's a reference to Psalm 1. And it's a very powerful reference that you'll now see. It's a very classic Jewish reference about what it is to be firmly rooted, what it is to be strong. And so it's wonderful to start seeing it. Now we're going to go into Psalm 3, and we'll keep dipping back. So I'm so thrilled because look what I have now. I have a large version, which Harold, thank you for this. Brilliant idea. I have a large version of the Psalms so I can see them better. Let's face it. Reading is getting harder and harder. These tiny little print books that were so cute, and you could carry them around so easily, not so easy to read from at a certain point. We all know that, right? But look how nice and big this is. Isn't that beautiful? It's not as easy to carry around, but it's a lot easier to read. So Psalm 3, and as we did before, this Psalm has 9 verses. It is very different from the first 2. And that's what's exciting about Psalms. You're going to start to get a feel for what different kinds of Psalms feel like. This one is quite different. That's another reason people often talk about Psalm 1 and 2 as being a little bit of a unit, beautifully pointed out by people in the class. There are differences, but ultimately they're about we classify them very loosely as wisdom Psalms, with the second Psalm having some nationalism in it, which is totally absent from the first Psalm. But let's look at Psalm 3 now, and I'm going to read it through in the Hebrew and then the English, and then we're going to dive in and we're going to stay with this Psalm as we go.
If I can get co-host, I can post it.
Okay.
CBST. I've been sending you chats you might not have seen.
I'm sorry, I haven't been seeing the chat. So should we stop for other questions, Sasha?
No. We shouldn't stop, but I'm asking to be made co-host.
Bruce, can you make Sasha a co-host, please? Bruce Roberts is helping us on the technology. There we go.
She's currently co-host.
Thank you, Bruce. Well, I guess I could read it from the screen as well. So I'm going to, again, I'll pause where we see the etnachta and try and notice where that is, the semicolon in the Hebrew, which is that wishbone. So Mismo Le David, Bivracho mipnei Absalom bino. Hashem ma rabu tzarai, rabim kamim alai. Rabim omrim lenafshi ein yeshuata lo be'elohim selah. Va'ata Hashem magen ba'adi, kvodi umerim roshi. Koli el Hashem ekra, va'aneni mehar kodsho selah. If we could move it, thank you. Ani shachachti va'ishana, hekitzoti ki Hashem yas mecheni. Lo ira merivot am asher saviv shatu alai. Kuma Hashem hoshieni Elohai ki hikita et kol oivai lechi shni rishaim shibarta. LaHashem hayeshua alamcha virchatecha selah. Okay, let's read the English. And again, this is a very, very, very basic translation. A psalm of David when he fled from his son Absalom. O Lord, my foes are so many. Many are those who attack me. Many say of me, there is no deliverance for him through God. Selah. But you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory, he who holds my head high. I cry aloud to the Lord. He answers me from his holy mountain. Selah. I lie down and sleep and awake again, for the Lord sustains me. I have no fear of the myriad forces arrayed against me on every side. Rise, O Lord, deliver me, O my God, for you slap all my enemies in the face. You break the teeth of the wicked. Deliverance is the Lord's. Your blessing be upon your people. Selah. So the first thing we notice if we look at the overview, even with this translation, is that it's very much what? Who is the speaker? What is the condition, what is the emotional state of the speaker of this psalm? And I think you could write this in the chat as an overview. the overall state is clearly to me, I shouldn't say clearly, to me, it's a person who is afraid, who is in deep fear. So let's start by looking at the Hebrew and understanding it more. So Mismo Le David. As I said last week, this is now the first psalm that we've encountered that actually makes this attribution, Mismo Le David. This is a song or a psalm or a Zamir, the shoresh, the root of the word Mismor is Zayin Mem Resh, the three-letter root. And let me just review. Semitic languages are, as a group, known, and the definition of a Semitic language, roughly, is that they share this feature grammatically, which is that every word has a root. Most of the roots are three-letter roots. Some are two-letter roots, but most are three-letter roots. And so a Semitic language that shares that feature, Hebrew, Arabic, Aramaic, Coptic, which is an ancient language still spoken by people in Egypt, mostly Christians in Egypt, and the Coptic Christians, by the way, still use Coptic as their language, their liturgical language. So those are some Semitic languages. So that's why you hear me say, what's the root of the word? Because the root teaches us something, not everything. And again, we have to adapt it. So Mismor, Zayin, Mem, Resh, other words that have that shoresh, that three-letter shoresh in it, the three-letter root, are all different kinds of words that have to do with singing, song, singer. And this is what's very different about Hebrew than English. We too have roots, but English is a German cognate language that has words from so many different sources. You can't see this kind of relationship that you can see in Hebrew. And Hebrew does what Hebrew does in very, very flexible and dramatic ways, can take a root. And Yael, who is a native Hebrew speaker, can do it naturally. I have to work hard at it. You can take a root and you could create a noun, you could create a verb. The verb can be passive, the verb can be active, the verb can be present tense, the verb can be past tense. You can take a root and do all different things with it. And in fact, great poets, and Yehuda Amichai is well known to do this, creates new words that are understood by the reader because he's taking a root and playing with it. So we can understand that the word might have something to do with something. We know whether it's a noun or a verb. We know whether it's we can tell a lot of things about it, even if we've never encountered that word before. It's a wonderful game you can play in Hebrew. So Mismo Le David. So this is what we call a superscription. It's different than other superscriptions we'll encounter in the Psalms because it's connected to the next part of the verse. Sometimes the Mismo Le David stands alone. In this case, Mismo Le David, so some kind of song. Yael, what would you say in modern Hebrew Mismor means? If Yael, I think Yael Bar Chava is with us. I'm just going to open a window in the room. A song, so you're saying a song too. Some of you know the Zamir chorale, which is a very famous singing group. Both there's a teen version, adult version, Zamir, also from that same shoresh of Mismor. A Zamir, Yael is saying, is a nightingale, which makes sense, right? A bird that sings, that's known for singing. So we know that, oops, we lost the Hebrew there, but okay, so Mismor Le David. So this is some kind of song of David. Now, again, Mismor is not the same word as the name of the book that we have is Sefer Tehillim, which is different than Mismor, but we'll hold on to that for now because I want to get through this verse. Mismor Le David, and the you can see under the David is an etnachta or an etnach, the wishbone, which means in the tradition of the cantillation marks, a semicolon, a pause, but not the end of a sentence. Now, a word about the name David. David, we know, of course, was King David. But we don't think it was pronounced David. We think the Vav had a little bit more, and I think in Arabic it's still pronounced this way, more of a W sound. So we actually think the name probably was pronounced, we don't know for sure, but I'm pretty sure in Arabic, if we have any Arabic speakers, they can correct me, it's pronounced Dawid. And I think that there are those who think that our original pronunciation of this name was not David as we sound it. Now, looking at it with a Daled, Vav, and a Daled makes a lot more sense, because one of the nicknames for David in Israel for a Hebrew speaker is unfortunate for American English speakers. But you can see if you look at the Hebrew Daled, Vav, Daled, if you were coming up with a diminutive or another way of calling it, a David in Israel is commonly called Dudu, which is unfortunate for American English speakers, but for Israelis, it sounds totally like a normal way to call David. Although, Yael, I don't think younger people do that, do they? Is Yael on? Can we, Yael, can you unmute for a second?
Yeah, I think it is kind of an older thing.
It's an older name.
More.
So you wouldn't hear a younger person called Dudu, but it's very common for Dudu Fisher, for instance, the great cantor. Cantor David Fisher was known as Cantor Dudu Fisher, which sounds bizarre to an American English speaker, but in Israeli, it's an old name, but it's probably going to come back like Max and Sophie have come back here, but it's not weird the way for us American English speakers are. And it's pretty funny because there are a bunch of Hebrew names like that are very awkward for English speakers, but normal, of course, for another language. So Jacob Nimi, do you have something to say about Arabic speakers? Would you unmute yourself?
Sure. Just to say that, I mean, I've listened to so many recordings of various piyutim being sung by Jewish singers and paitanim and chazanim in North African Jewish communities, and I hear the vav being pronounced as a W.
Yeah, there you go.
There are two, from Arabic it is transliterated either one of two ways. One is Dawood, another is Dawood.
Yeah. So we think that this was probably in biblical Hebrew pronounced that way as well. But it's very interesting because for us, David is such a basic name for us that we think of as such a Jewish name that to imagine it wasn't pronounced anything like that's fascinating. So who was David? Before we could go on, let's just make sure we understand who was David in our tradition. It's going to become very important. So thank you, Peter Klein, so that you could see all the different, none of them pronounce it with a V sound. So that's why we do not believe that it was pronounced David then. But we pronounce it David now. So who was King David? Let's just remember this to make this, now that we're coming up to talking about who is the one who's attributed as the author of the Psalms. He's also attributed as the author of Song of Songs, which was the Pesach Megillah that we read on Pesach. So David was the first king. Remember, David became the king. He was the best friends with Jonathan, for those who remember that story. And it wouldn't be bad to look him up if you have some free time this afternoon to learn a little bit about King David and how he fits in. Now, the interesting thing about this is that King Saul was the first king, we remember, which is after the creation of the United Kingdom, which was the first United Kingdom, was this Israelite kingdom where Saul was the king, and then David became the king. But Saul's son was Jonathan. So Jonathan should have become the king, and there's a whole story to why that didn't happen. But most of David's career, he spent fleeing somebody. And who was he running away from? Saul. Most of the stories we have of David running away, he's running away from Saul, who sees him as a threat to taking over his crown, which in fact he was. So we have many stories of David hiding in Ein Gedi and in the desert and in the caves, and Jonathan coming to find him and to help him escape his own father. So we do have a lot of stories of David as a young man fleeing and being in exile and running away and fearing for his life. But guess what? That's not what this psalm is talking about, his fleeing and running away. This psalm is talking about a different time in his life, which was when he ran away, bivracho, when he was running away or fleeing. So this is Mismo Le David, a song of David, bivracho. So the shoresh here is bet resh chet. The middle three words, letters. And so the song of David in his running away from, I'm being extremely literal, in his running away, mipnei, from the face of Absalom bino. So this is a song of David when he was running away, not from King Saul, which is what most of his time was as a young person, but now he's running away from Absalom. And in case you have any lack of clarity about who Absalom is, he doesn't just give us Absalom's name. He says Bino, his son. Wow. So this is when David is running away from his own son, not from the king who was afraid that David was about to kill him. That happened a lot, and that's kind of understandable, right? You're going to unseat a king, the king's going to run after you. But this is when David was running away from his own son. So you have to pause a moment and just imagine, you don't even have to know the whole story yet of Absalom, but how powerful this sentence is. That this is a moment where we're describing the fear of a human being. And remember, it doesn't say David HaMelech here, the King David. It doesn't identify him. It just says this is a story, a song of a time when David was running away from his own son. So there's kind of a poignancy immediately. This isn't just nationalistic and political. It's not just a moment of kings and armies clashing. It's a moment that David is running away from his son, Absalom. So Absalom, as somebody points out, let's look at what the word itself means. An amazing name, right? Avshalom, Av, the first two letters mean father, and Shalom, peace. So irony upon ironies, right? Add this on top of it. Who is he running away from? Somebody whose name is the father of peace, who is his son. So if you look at Avshalom Bino, Av is father, the beginning of the word of his name. And then Bino, it's very poetic, right? Avshalom Bino, father of peace, his son. It's a very, it's very powerful. So you might have heard of the name, and Yael, is anybody named Absalom anymore in Israel? No. Also, biblical names in general in Israel are of an earlier generation. Chana Gaffney will tell you this too. Not so many Chanas anymore. Not so many Rachels, not so many Sarah. All of those biblical names, which were very, very, very popular in the first several generations before the state existed. And then that first generation after the state. Wouldn't you say that's true, Yael? The older, your contemporaries, there were probably biblical names, right? Your name is a biblical name. But children now, nobody is named Rachel. Nobody's named Rivka. There's no biblical names among Jews. In fact, it's very popular now in Israel to use names that are not gendered and male and female using same names. It's a very interesting issue about how Israelis relate to even these biblical names. And Ayelet Cohen tells a story about her uncle who made Aliyah in the late 60s, and his English name is Richard, and his Hebrew name is Rachmiel. So when he made Aliyah in the late 60s, he adopted his Hebrew name Rachmiel, and now everybody calls him Richie. Nobody in Israel would call him Rachmiel now. It's just not, nobody uses it. That he tried so hard to adopt a biblical Jewish, and it was his name. It wasn't like he was even creating a new name, but Israelis. And by the way, Israelis refuse to call me Sharon, which would be how you'd pronounce my name with a biblical or even with a Hebrew name. No Israeli will call me that. They only call me Sharon. Like they kind of even emphasizing my name, which is from the Bible, they'll only use, is very funny. Anyway, so Absalom. Who was Absalom? Has anybody ever read a great American novel with Absalom in the title? Anybody can identify a very famous American novel?
Absalom.
Right. It's not only is it in the title once, it's in the title twice. William Faulkner's great. I think he even won a Pulitzer Prize for that, for Absalom, Absalom. I read that in college. It's not an easy read, but it is an amazing book. Absalom, Absalom, William Faulkner's great book about the South and the metaphor of the South destructing itself. And the metaphor of the whole book, of course, is the father who's destroying the son who's destroying the father. So Absalom, Absalom, famous American book. And it's used Absalom as a name to evoke this image of a son who's going to destroy or is trying to destroy the father. And I want to read.
He won the Nobel Prize. Maybe.
Nobel Prize. Sorry, I knew he won. There was a. He won the Nobel Prize. I didn't realize that. I knew he won. This is a. It's and if you have never read Faulkner, he's an amazing writer. Not easy reading, but I read Faulkner in a class in college that just did Faulkner, and it was an amazing deep dive. And that's what you need. Faulkner needs a deep dive. And we read Absalom, Absalom, and what was his other great book? That's okay. I can't remember.
As I Lay Dying.
What?
As I Lay Dying. There's a whole.
No, Sound and Fury.
Sound and Fury.
Sound and Fury. Those are the two. I spent, I think, an entire semester on those two books. Anyway, I didn't do so well though. That's when I decided not to be an English major. Anyway, but I loved reading them. But so we see in this first sentence poignancy. We don't know the political context. We don't know, is this being used as a metaphor or are we telling David's personal story? Mismo Le David, Bivracho Mipnei Absalom Bino. So that I find it so powerful. In general, when you see in biblical Hebrew, and we see the Bino in the story, by the way, about Avraham and Yitzchak, over and over it says, Yitzchak Bino. Why do we get that emphasis? The Bible is spare in its language, and when you see a familial relationship being emphasized by being even placed in the sentence, we know who Absalom is. We know who David is. But to say Bino is a way of lifting up and amplifying not just the person, but the relationship. And you'll see if you go back and you look at the story of Isaac and Abraham and the Akedat Yitzchak, you see Bino is said over and over again because it's poignant. Oh my God. This is a story about David who's fleeing from Absalom, his son. So why was David fleeing from his son? So that you could also study. You could just Google it this afternoon, but very briefly, and it's in the book of Shmuel, of Samuel. The story is a very moving story that Absalom, for various reasons, when David is already king, wants to kill his father and become king. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. But I want to get through a few more psukim, few more verses. And David's response, which I just want to, one of my favorite, I want to get the sentence correct. David ultimately, which is not part of the story of this psalm, but I do want to point out that Absalom is ultimately killed by David's forces, not by David himself, but by David's men, by David's troops or his forces. He's ultimately killed. And you'll notice, is there anywhere in this psalm that it talks about Absalom's death? What happens to how is this, the first verse resolved anywhere in this psalm? No, nowhere in this psalm does it go back to the story of Absalom and David. That's powerful to me for a couple of reasons. The most important is that I think the first verse is setting up tremendous fear. It's not trying to just tell the story of David and Absalom, but what was David saying when he was in this moment that then becomes something useful for anybody who's feeling terrible fear. But what happens to Absalom is that he is ultimately killed by David's forces. And then we have the really famous line that I just pulled out to read to you that is so beautiful. So even though David was pursued by Absalom and David himself had to flee and hide, when he hears that his son has been killed, he says, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, Would God I had died for you, O Absalom, my son, my son. So that's so poignant to balance that out with here that he's fleeing from his son, and yet even when his son is killed, he has tremendous fear of grief. So let me pause now, and let's see if there are questions or comments, and if not, if we want to go on. But let me just stop there and just with that first verse and get some questions or responses.
Well, we just had wondering about the story of him getting entangled in a tree by his hair as he flees David, Harold, and Yael.
You know what? I don't remember if that story is actually in Samuel or in the Talmud. Is it? So the famous story of his death is that he got entangled in a tree, which I think is very interesting given what we learned about the tree in Psalm 1. And he's then killed while he's tangled in a tree. I can't remember if that's actually in Samuel or that's the Talmud version. But yes, but then David hears about it. David's not there at his death. Hair and power. Interesting. Well, Absalom was known to be very vain. He was supposed to be very handsome, and he cared a lot about how he looked, as the traditional stories about him. There are many stories about his personal vanity. He was very charismatic, and he had huge followings, and that's how he was able to develop this following to rise up against his own father. But as we know in stories of monarchies and Shakespeare, we know for sure this story of sons and Freud, right? Sons wanting to kill their fathers is an ancient story. And this is one of those stories of sons wanting to kill their fathers. Freud would have a lot to say about that. Harold?
Rabbi, when I did my, am I unmuted? When I did my reading about this, there's some thought that that first line is a superscription, that at one point it wasn't part of the psalm, and someone wrote and said, I think that this is probably written by David about his son Absalom, and it became part of the psalm.
In truth, as we keep saying, and we have no idea how the Psalms were ultimately put together. So superscriptions are one of the big questions that people have. People don't know about the last verse. You'll feel that there are some things that are jarring in a psalm. And one of the ways to resolve jarring in literature is to say it was not part of the original one. On the other hand, we could read something that a single author writes where a piece of that unit is jarring. It could be. We just don't know. But for sure, Harold's correct. That's one of the theories. And ultimately, for me, the origin story is less compelling to me. I'm given this text and I want to find personal meaning now. But yes, that's one of the ways that people try and understand it or talk about it. I think that the imagery of it is so powerful, right? A father to be running away from his son. Other questions or comments? I can't see the chat right now without
There were a couple
losing.
early questions.
Uh-huh.
Ellen was curious about the mem, what the mem added to the root. I think when we were just on the first word.
Yes, Ms. Moore. So mem in the beginning of a word usually has to do with it becoming a noun. There are some mems, which I mentioned in one of the Psalms, which is called in biblical grammar, and actually it's true in modern Hebrew too, but less significant. It's called this is one of these wonderful grammatical things, a locative mem, which means it creates location. So like the word makom. So you look at a word like makom, the shoresh, the root for makom, the mem is rare. In other words, the most important thing to know is that the mem in the beginning of a word is rarely part of the root of the word. It's used in Hebrew a lot to create a noun. In some words, it creates a word of location, like makom. The shoresh is kuf, probably yud mem. The shoresh of the three-letter roots is probably kuf, yud, mem. And the mem in makom creates place, which literally is the location, right? But there are a lot of words in Hebrew, and I'm right now blanking, where mem words are about a location. Mishkan, right? We're taking the shoresh for Mikdash. Excellent, Harold. I'm blanking, but so you think about the mem creates a noun for sure. And often that noun has to do with location. In this case, it's creating a noun, but it has nothing to do with location.
And then on Mismor, Betsy is wondering about the punctuation of the second mem.
So that punctuation, that cantillation mark is a conjunctive cantillation mark, which means it leads into the next word. So it means it's connected to the next word, making the first two words a phrase. So in other words, you shouldn't read it according to the tradition. By the way, the tradition of cantillation is not as old as the words themselves. So there was an oral tradition about how they were read. And that oral tradition, the words were also oral tradition, says that they should be read Mismo Le David, not, don't read it as Mismo Le David bivracho. So it's telling us that the break comes after David, not after the third word or the fourth word or any other place. It's saying those two words belong together. But Cantor Nimi is with us, and they actually have musical meaning. Those of you who can lane can sing it with the musical meaning, but the grammatical meaning or the punctuation meaning is that it's connected. Those two, it's a conjunctive rather than a disjunctive. If I'm talking too fast or saying gibberish, just say stop, explain, or something in the chat. I hope that's helpful. So you have to imagine in the Torah text where these words exist, there are no vowel marks. There's no punctuation marks. So we don't have the vowels and we don't have punctuation. Those come later and they're added in order to help us read it. But honestly, sometimes the punctuation is controversial, not in this particular sentence, but there are places in the Torah where we have debates over what the punctuation is because it can mean different things with different punctuation. It can mean different things with different vowels. So the vowels and punctuation are not as old as the words. Wow, isn't that crazy to think that? So Hebrew vowels are not part of the roots of words. They are the markings below and sometimes above the letters. And it's a consonant-only language, written language. I don't know if there are other languages like that since I'm not, there are other languages like that, Harold?
Arabic is generally written without the vowels, but in sacred texts like the Quran, where the pronunciation is extremely important, they put in vowels so you will know. So it's the
same thing. They're both Semitic languages. So that's something that they share as Semitic languages.
And then Megan wonders who added the punctuation to the Psalms, because wouldn't that change the meaning?
Sometimes they do. And that's why sometimes there's controversy. You'll look at a Torah text. There are places where we have different versions of the punctuation and you could see and we're told this is how it's read, even though this is how it's written. We're given those distinctions. So here's the problem with history and with texts that are ancient as opposed to most of the things we read in English, right, are from the last 100 years, honestly. There are very few things we read that are older than 100 years ago. Okay, there's some 19th century books we read a lot of. All right, so 200 years. But before 200 years in English, if we read Shakespeare, if we read Chaucer, if we read those books for texts from that time, usually we're doing it in class with teachers who are helping us work through it. So we're talking about texts that are 2,500 years old, where we mostly were written on parchment, which mostly does not survive. The only things we usually have from historical moments of that age are things that are on are on clay pots, written on clay pots, or written on shards. Yes, Harold has a hand up.
Well, if we want to do this, I sent you something earlier today that I bet you haven't opened yet. I did some research over the weekend and I can show some images, but I don't want to do it in the last 5 minutes, maybe tomorrow or Wednesday.
Right, I haven't seen it yet.
Images. Yeah, it's fascinating.
Okay, yeah, so it's something that modern minds have a hard time grokking. If people were mostly writing on parchment, parchment does.
Rabbi, can you start that sentence over? You're getting slow.
How do we know anything? All right. Woo. So you have to remember,
Rabbi, you're frozen.
most
You got
documents
frozen. Can you
were
go
on
back to the beginning of that
parchment.
sentence?
Can you hear? No, I'm frozen. Am I still frozen?
Now good.
Now you're
Oh,
back.
good.
No,
Okay.
no, you're good.
It's important for us to flex our imaginations to keep remembering. You can't just open up a book to say, what was it like 2,500 years ago? There are very few written documents we have from this period of time. Very few. In fact, in terms of Jewish texts, I'd say zero. So what we have are the traditions that were mostly passed down orally, and then at a certain point started getting written down. And as they were getting written down, people were adding things to help people remember what they were. So we don't actually know a lot of things that are very frustrating that we don't really know. There are traditions that we have, and we know when we have the first written texts of anything. So when do we have the first written text of the Psalms, even though we know the Psalms are older than this? When is the first piece of parchment we have that has a psalm on it? Anybody who's been on an Israel trip with me should know this. Harold went very well. The Qumran, in Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls. The reason the Dead Sea Scrolls are so important, and maybe I'll dedicate a class to this because it's super important and we have to end. Maybe I'll start tomorrow with, it's 10:42, right? Let me say one thing about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then maybe I'll say something more tomorrow. The Dead Sea Scrolls date the Bible, sections of the Bible, not the entire Bible, to about the time of Jesus, roughly. So just imagine, around the time of Jesus, which was what, 2,000 years ago? I'm bad at math, right? Jesus was 2,000 years ago, roughly. So before that, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the earliest text we had of the Bible was 1,000 years after Jesus. So 1,000 years ago. So up until the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the earliest text we had of the Bible was from the year 1000. That's about 1,000 years ago. That's the earliest we had. We didn't know what the Bible looked like at the time of Jesus, except through the Greek translations and the Vulgate and the Latin translations, but we didn't have in our hands a Hebrew to say, how close were they? How off were they? Until the year, think about that. These texts we're studying now are 1,500 years earlier than the earliest text we had until the Dead Sea Scrolls. When did we discover the Dead Sea Scrolls? We'll talk about that tomorrow since we're hitting time. So tomorrow I'll talk about that because it makes this question of how do we know what we know is a fantastic question, which is why I love archaeology and all those. But you have to have a very flexible mind, which is hard work for me. So thank you, everybody. Keep with the questions. We're going to stay, obviously, with Psalm 3 for a while. We began the first verse, and tomorrow I'll talk a little bit more about the Dead Sea Scrolls and maybe look at some of these ancient texts. If you have more questions, write them down, bring them tomorrow. And wonderful to be studying with all of you. And I'm so happy we're back to 4 days a week. Julia, do you want to lead us out with a little singing?
Sure. Yai die 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 yai die 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 yai die 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 yai die 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 yai die yai die 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 yai die 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 yai die 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 die. Yai die, yai die, yai die, 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 yai die, die, die. And I will bring the words tomorrow.
Wonderful. Thank you, everybody. And I want to let everyone know we're not doing a town hall tonight because it is Yom HaShoah. So at 7 o'clock tonight, we will be having a Yom HaShoah Holocaust Memorial observance with all the other downtown synagogues via Zoom. And we'll be sending out an email today about that. It should be up on our website. It should be on our Facebook page. But tonight, 7 o'clock, observance of Yom HaShoah. Thank you, everybody. See you tomorrow. Wonderful to study with you.